Hello, this is Austin Meyer, author of X-Plane and Xavion. This video is company proprietary to Beta. This video should not be shared outside of Beta. So today what we're going to look at is the math that proves what will make a good eVTOL. There's a gajillion eVTOL concepts out there. Let's look at some provable math that will indicate which aircraft will actually work. And when I say work, what I mean is they're going to have low hover power requirements and low cruise power requirements. And since driving battery weight down is the absolute key, we need to minimize the energy requirement of these airplanes. That's I mean, given a limited amount of energy we can carry with these batteries, driving the energy requirement of the airplane down is just the driving factor of the whole airplane. So how do we minimize the energy consumption of the airplane? That's what we want to do to have a successful eVTOL. Let's start with the propeller. This is a fundamental equation, F equals m dot delta V. F is the force coming out of a propeller. M dot is the mass flow rate of air going sucked through the propeller. And delta V is how much the air is sped up going through the propeller. All right, look at this video. You can clearly see the m dot, right? You can just see all that air getting pulled through the disk there. That's the m dot. It's the kilograms per second of air going through the disk. And you can also see the delta V. That's how much the air is accelerating going through the disk. And so you can almost see the force on this rotor by multiplying the mass flow rate times how much the air is accelerated. That's the force on that rotor. Now, let's look at the power required to turn a propeller, okay, or to turn a rotor. The power required is 1/2 m dot delta V squared. Whoa, we got a square term there. What does that mean? It means that if we double our delta V, okay, in other words, spin up that motor more, turn that prop, faster, double the delta V going through that disk, then we will double our force from the prop. We'll double the thrust. Yay, double the delta V, double the thrust. Who doesn't like that? Well, since power goes to the delta V squared, we'll multiply the power times 4. In other words, if we double the disk loading, or double how much we accelerate the air coming through that disk, we double our thrust, but we multiply our power times 4. The higher the delta V through the disk, the more we accelerate the air through the disk, the higher the power requirement compared to the thrust. In other words, the lower the efficiency. Okay, so here's some airplanes that will illustrate the point. Here we have a helicopter hovering. Notice he has a fairly low delta V. His delta V is on the order of maybe 20 knots or something like that at the rotor disk. And he can hover for 2 hours or so, this helicopter. Now let's look at a Harrier jump jet. His delta V is more like the speed of sound. His jet exhaust is the speed of sound. He's got an insanely huge delta V. He can hover for on the order of 2 minutes. And that's including dumping water into the engine to keep it from overheating while he's doing it. So this is an illustration of 2 aircraft, one of which has a huge m dot and a low delta V, a huge mass flow rate through that gigantic rotor disk and a low air acceleration, and another one that has a tiny m dot from that tiny little compressor inside the airplane and a gigantic delta V. And you can see from these 2 aircraft that the way to hover efficiently is to have a gigantic rotor disk that has a low delta V, a small amount of air acceleration. Okay, we do a little substitution, and you can pause the video and do the substitution yourself if you like, but we arrive at this equation. P equals 1/2 F delta V. The power required to put out a given force is 1/2 times the force times the air acceleration at the prop, delta V. Now, the force that the prop puts out is equal to the weight of the airplane in hover. There's no denying that. And so we finally arrive at the ultimate equation here. Power equals 1/2 the weight of the airplane times delta V. This is the power required to hover an airplane. 1/2 times the weight of the airplane times the airspeed through the prop disk. Now, of course, there's some propeller efficiency factors and stuff like that, and that's down to the fine design of the propeller blades and whatnot. But this is your theoretical ultimate case where this goes. So what do we do to minimize our hover power requirement? Well, we have an airplane that weighs less, right? And we accelerate the air through the disk less. Look at this. Accelerating the air through the disk less is exactly as important as making the airplane weigh less. So however hard we work to make the airplane have lower weight, we should work equally hard to have a lower airspeed acceleration through the disk. And the only way to have lower airspeed acceleration through the disk is to have the disk be larger. So this is fundamental. Weight reduction and airspeed increase reduction through the disk are equally critical for hover power. And a larger disk does this. Okay, now let's look at the wing. Wing, coefficient of lift times the wing area times the airplane speed squared times air density divided by 2 equals the lift on the wing. It's an equation for lift. Induced drag is the coefficient of induced drag times the wing area times v squared, airplane squared, times air density divided by 2. All right, you can see these equations mirror each other quite well. The coefficient of induced drag is the coefficient of squared divided by pi EAR. E being the Oswald's efficiency factor for your wing, which is probably around 85 or 90% or so, and aspect ratio being how long and thin the wing is. Substitute these equations into each other and get induced drag equals CL squared over pi EAR times S v squared over 2. In other words, the induced drag on the airplane is the coefficient of squared divided by pi times Oswald's efficiency factor times the aspect ratio, all multiplied by the wing area times the speed squared times air density over 2. Pause the video if you want, substitute the equations in to each other, and then what you finally see is the induced drag is equal to the lift on the wing times the coefficient of lift divided by pi, 3.14, times E, the Oswald's efficiency factor for the wing, probably 85 or 90%, times AR, aspect ratio, how long and thin the wing is. Now, in cruise, we must agree that the lift of the wing is equal to the weight of the airplane. And so then substitute in weight for lift, and we get this little equation here. The induced drag on the airplane is equal to the weight of the airplane times the coefficient of lift divided by pi and E, efficiency factor for the wing, and AR, aspect ratio, how long and thin the wing is. What does this equation mean? Well, you should see something that's kind of similar to the propeller equation here on the wing. If we want to minimize the induced drag, and let me tell you about induced drag real quick. Induced drag is a drag due to the production of lift. Induced drag is the drag penalty you pay to bear the weight of the aircraft. Whether you're going fast, slow, makes no difference. You're always paying an induced drag penalty. And the slower you go, the worse your induced drag get. That's the drag to hold the airplane in the air. And it's critical that it be minimized because we're carrying a lot of weight in the air here. So how do we minimize induced drag? Well, we need to make the airplane weigh less. That's obvious. You already knew that. Another thing we need to do is lower the coefficient of lift. How do you lower the coefficient of lift of a wing and stay in the air? The answer is simple. Have a bigger wing. The bigger the wing, the lower the coefficient of lift needs to be to bear the same weight. And you can see that in that equation here. Pause the video if you like and look at it and convince yourself why, if you increase the wing area and lower your coefficient of lift by the same amount, the total lift will remain the same. So we need a low coefficient of lift to minimize our induced drag. The way to have a low coefficient of lift is to have a large wing. Another way we can minimize induced drag, well, we can't change pi, that's 3.14. Our Oswald's efficiency factor is going to be carefully designed to be 0.9 or so by having the perfectly shaped wing. But look at this AR, aspect ratio. That's how long and thin the wing is. If we can have a wing with twice the aspect ratio, in other words, it's twice as long and thin, that will literally cut our induced drag in half. So in other words, as hard as we work to lower weight, we will get an equal reduction in induced drag by increasing aspect ratio. In other words, by making our wing long and thin. In other words, a long, thin wing is just as important as saving weight when it comes to minimizing the induced drag of the airplane. And also having a low coefficient of lift. So in other words, having a large wing is just as important as saving weight when it comes to reducing induced drag. And so that's the wing requirement. Now let's look at the body. The coefficient of parasite drag is equal to the coefficient of parasite drag times the body area times the airplane speed squared times the air density divided by 2. Looks familiar? This should start to look familiar about now. So the size of the body. We all know we want the airplane to be small to have less drag. That's S. The airplane's going to be as big or small as it is. V squared, how fast we're going. Well, we're going to go the speed we're going to build the airplane for, or depending on how fast we want to get there. You can see now why we'll have less drag if we slow down, right? Drag goes to the V squared. And air density. Well, I don't think we're changing the air density. I mean, we can climb up to higher altitude and reduce the air density a bit, but we'll exhaust our batteries by the time we've climbed up to high altitude. So we're not going really high with these airplanes. And so given that our airplane size kind of is what it is, our speed is as fast as we got to go, our air density is what Mother Nature gives us, if we want to reduce our parasite drag, we need to reduce our coefficient of drag. And how do you reduce the coefficient of drag on an airplane? Well, this is the most streamlined shape in the world right here for subsonic flight. And that coefficient of drag is 0.05. This is the draggiest shape in the world. And that is the coefficient of drag to 1.25. So you can see what your coefficient of drag is going to look like here. I mean, it goes from 0.05 to 1.25. Depending on the shape of your body. So you want the airplane to look like this, a streamlined shape. And once you see what these possible coefficients of drag are and what this equation is, then you get parasite drag is the coefficient of drag times the body size squared times v squared times air density over 2. So these are the three equations here in red that literally govern how efficient the airplane is. The propeller needs to be attached to an aircraft that has minimum weight and has a minimum airspeed acceleration through the disc, which means the disc needs to be large. To minimize the induced drag for bearing our lift, we need to have a minimum aircraft weight and a minimum coefficient of lift, which means you have a large wing, so each bit of the wing only puts out a little bit of lift. That's a low coefficient of lift. And we need to have a high aspect ratio, long and thin wing. And for our parasite drag, we need to have a minimum drag coefficient, which means it needs to look like this. And so with these three simple equations, I have proven mathematically that the most successful eVTOL will have large rotors, well, it'll be lightweight, it'll have large rotors for low delta V, it'll have large wings for low coefficient of lift, the wings will be long and thin, high aspect ratio, and the body will be shaped about like this to minimize drag. Those are the characteristics you're going to look for in an efficient eVTOL. A large, thin wing with large rotors and a streamlined body. Look for those in an eVTOL. That's going to be your successful design. So as I look at eVTOLs, I've basically broken them down into three types, where each type has increasing complexity and perhaps better performance. So let's start with the Type 1. The Type 1 aircraft, in my definition, has zero moving parts except the actual spinning propellers and moving flight controls. There's no vectored thrust, there's no tilting wings, there's no variable pitch props. This is the minimum possible number of moving parts. So the propellers that lift always lift. The propeller that pushes always pushes. And a fascinating thing about this design is that the lifting propellers can be built out of one piece of foam and carbon fiber. No moving parts, one piece of foam and carbon fiber, and still be perfectly optimized for the speed that they operate, which is hover speed. They only lift. There's no speed coming through that disc except the delta V as the air is accelerated. The pusher prop, one piece of foam and carbon fiber, no moving parts. It can still be optimized for the cruise speed of the airplane. So what's so fascinating about the Type 1 is not only does it have a minimum number of moving parts, but each propeller can be optimized for the job it does with no propeller articulation at all. Above the Type 1 in complexity is the Type 2. Now the Type 2 starts vectoring its thrust. Possibly the wing and almost certainly the propeller can vector up and down, adding complexity. But the Type 2 has a limit. It must have small propellers. This is literally a requirement of the Type 2 design, small props. And here's why. If you were to have a large propeller on this airplane, then the airspeed going through that disc might only be 25 knots in hover, right? If this is a very large disc, then the airspeed is going to go through that disc at maybe only 25 knots in hover. A large disc has a low delta V. Then, when you tilted forwards, the airplane would only be efficient in cruise up to a speed of about 25 knots. It'd be useless. Because once the airplane is going forwards, clearly the speed through the prop disc is going to be the speed of the airplane, plus the delta V from thrust. And you cannot build a single piece propeller that will both hover at 25 knots of delta V through the disc and go forwards at 125 knots. You can't build one prop that's efficient in both those speed ranges without any moving parts. A Cessna 172 basically takes this idea about as far as it can go, and that airplane can only get up to about 100 knots. and the propeller is very inefficient down at 25 knots early in the takeoff roll. So this Type 2 with its fixed pitch props is limited to small propellers because the small propeller will have a high delta V in hover. So if you're hovering in a Type 2 airplane with these small dinky little props, you might see 75 knots of speed through the disc in hover and maybe 125 knots of speed through the disc in flight. This is a pretty narrow speed range. Can you design one fixed pitch propeller that can both handle the delta V of say 75 knots at hover and the speed through the disc of 125 knots in cruise? The answer is yes. That's a close enough speed range you can build one fixed pitch prop to handle both of these speeds. But if you're out of a really large prop with maybe a 25 knot speed through the disc, it would be an unworkable design, an unworkable propeller, because it couldn't work at both 25 knot hover and 125 knot cruise. So the Type 2 has the minimum additional complexity of just vectored thrust, but it still has the simplicity of fixed pitch props, but it comes at a price. The props must be small to have a high delta V, because only then will the hover and cruise conditions be close to each other, which they must be for a fixed pitch prop. And these aircraft are always going to have a terrible hover power requirement, because these small props are going to have a huge delta V, which, as you know, is a huge power requirement. So how do we solve this? The answer is we go for a nice big prop to get a low delta V. But then that big prop cannot handle both hover and cruise because it's such a wide speed range. You have to start adjusting the pitch of the props to handle the varying speed, and that takes us to the Type 3. The Type 3, it vectors its thrust, maybe it moves its wing as well, and with that nice big prop, it's only got a delta V of 25 knots in hover. But in cruise, it's got maybe 125 knots going through the disc, maybe 115 knots of cruise and another 10 knots of delta V from thrust production. And because of this hugely wide speed range, the prop absolutely must, without question, adjust its tilt. So it goes to a flat pitch, like downshifting core into first gear for hover, and as the speed builds up, it shifts up into fifth gear by opening up that prop pitch to adjust to the higher inflow. And so the Type 1 has propellers that are always optimized for the job they're doing with no moving parts. The Type 2 has the next level of moving parts, just vectored thrust, but the props must be small. So they have a high delta V, so the prop can have a shape that works both for hover and cruise. The Type 3 goes to the large prop and always aims a prop in the right direction, but does so with the complexity of now having variable pitch props. So there's these levels of complexity, and this Type 3 always has multiple failure points for adjusting the prop pitch and the prop vector. This type has a high hover power requirement due to that small prop that has to be designed for both hover and cruise with the same prop. Type 1, the only drawback is you don't have every propeller working for you all of the time. And so these props have to be stowed in a low drag configuration in cruise. And so these are the three types of aircraft and some of the drawbacks of each. Now let's look at some airplanes that use these. So here we go. Let's start with an idea I just want to get rid of right now. The flying car. This is a design that I believe makes no sense at all. Why is that? Well, the best thing you can say about a car is that it hugs the road, right? It hugs the road. A good car is completely unaffected by the air. Is the best thing you can say about an airplane that it hugs the runway and like never wants to leave the ground? No. A car needs to be small, dense, heavy, and unaffected by the air. An airplane needs to be the exact opposite of that. Flying cars are never going to be both good cars and good airplanes. It's not going to happen. Let's just get past it. Let's also get past this. So what some people might think is, okay, so you can't have a vehicle that's both a good car and a good airplane. So how about you fly around in the top half and then you attach to the bottom half to drive around the city? Okay, so here's my question to you. Is it that terrible to get out of the airplane and stretch your legs for a minute before you get in the car? Is that the thing we're trying to avoid here? You know, at all costs, we must avoid
the legs stretch as we get out of the airplane and walk 10 feet to the car. That needs to be avoided at all costs. For me, about the most fun thing in the world to do is land somewhere in an airplane, get out, and walk to my destination if it's nearby. And of course, you can take an Uber or a car. Better get a bike. That's always fun. A bike is a lot more fun than a car. To get to your destination. So let's just get past this garbage right now. This is designed to make sure nobody ever is actually allowed to walk outside. And I hate it. Okay, let's look at something else so I'm going to get past pretty quickly. The helicopter. Yes, this is a helicopter. A helicopter always has its rotors acting upwards. And as it moves forward, one of the blades is charging ahead into the air. And on the retreat, it's retreating away from the air. Because of this, the blade is never really operating at an ideal speed. And it's not exactly operating at an ideal angle of attack either. This is nothing but a helicopter, and a helicopter can be fine for hovering and low-speed operations. But a helicopter is never going to go fast, efficiently in the forward direction. And the reason for that is the propeller isn't pulling it the direction it's going. And the advancing blade's going too fast, the retreating blade's going too slow. There's nothing wrong with helicopters, but ultimately they're not going to perform as well as VTOLs. Props are aimed in the right direction. All right, here's another one. This is also a helicopter. It's just many little blades instead of one big one. Okay, speaking of many blades instead of one big one, here's another helicopter. So all three of these vehicles are helicopters. There's nothing wrong with a helicopter. There will be electric helicopters in the future doing business and doing work, no question. But these are the vehicles that are going to be more interested in staying still or operating at very low speeds in the air. Our mission at Beta is to deliver product far, fast, and efficiently. And so that rules out helicopters right there. Helicopters are going to be low speed or holding their place in the sky without motion. So let's get past the helicopters. Another thing we need to get away from right now is high drag vehicles. Remember that flat plate that I showed you is like the highest drag shape that could ever exist? Well, that's partially from the flat leading edge just pounding into the air. But more than that, it was the flat trailing edge where the air came over and broke into all this low pressure suction and vortices, just pulling the thing back. A flat back is worse than a flat front. This vehicle, it's got it. The drag of this vehicle is going to be crazy, not just from the flat back, but also all of this. This is all flat plate area. This, as you see, is the worst shape aerodynamically possible when it comes to adding drag, a vertical flat surface. You don't want that. Let's take a look at another one. All right, again, high drag. Look at it basically, for all intents and purposes, flat back there. This is a helicopter with high drag. Let's take a look at another one. Another helicopter with high drag. The flat back of this vehicle is going to cause the air to break up into turbulence and vortices back behind the vehicle. The blades are always going to be going too fast as they advance and too slow as they retreat. The blades on this vehicle will never be happy. The body on this vehicle will never be happy. Let's take a look at another idea that kind of misses the boat here. This vehicle is kind of nice in that it's got a ton of disk area, right? These people clearly understood that disk area is king. A nice big disk to get a minimum delta V for minimum power requirement. But they kind of messed us up during the transition here. These ducts are well known to stall during transition and mess up the airflow coming into the duct during the transition. And they seem to have forgotten the wing part of the job. It's not exactly obvious from this photo, but the wings on this vehicle are almost non-existent. And that breaks the large wings that are long and thin and high aspect ratio rule that we discussed. Here we go. So here we go. They seem to have forgotten the wing at all. They think that the wing doesn't even exist apparently. we want a large wing with a high aspect ratio. It's like they just forgot to draw that. Again, you want a large wing with a high aspect ratio. And these people, they kind of remember the disk area to a certain degree by having kind of large rotors, but then they forgot the wing part. So that was forgotten. Now let's look at vectored ducts. Now we're going to get into vehicles we're going to start to take seriously here. We're moving up to Type 2 vehicles here. And Type 2 is not ideal, as you remember, because their flow speed through the disk is too high in hover. And the reason their flow speed is too high in hover through that disk is because those propellers are optimized for cruise, they're fixed pitch props, and so they also have high speed at hover, just like they do in cruise. It's the only way you can have a fixed pitch prop is if cruise and hover are about the same. So the hover speed is high, the hover delta V is high, the hover power requirement is huge. And if you do the math on the Lilium, you can see with this small disk area, all right, it's almost missing a disk area. The disk area is so small. The hover power requirement on this vehicle is around 1,000 horsepower. And we don't want to have 1,000 horsepower hover to just barely stay in the air with such a small vehicle. There's almost no disk area, so it's an extremely high delta V in hover. Here's another one that is kind of similar to the Lilium. It may not look similar to the Lilium, but it actually is, because it's got a pretty nice wing, a pretty nice body, only a passing thought to stability and control with the tail feathers, and kind of small disc area with some ducted fans. This is just like a Lilium where you took all the little ducted fans and just made 4 slightly bigger ones. But the disc area here is still very low. And since the disc area is low, the hover power requirement will be high. It's a high hover power requirement airplane because of the low disc area. But we're starting to get better though. Now let's go to Vahana. This is a clear Type 2. We've got the articulating wings here and the articulating thrust vector to get the thrust aimed the direction we want. But the propellers are small enough that the flow speed through the discs in hover is not that different from cruise. And that's what lets this thing have a fixed pitch prop. But that high speed through the disc and hover is what drives the hover power requirement up. And also the wing is going to kind of partially stall to at least some degree every time it approaches to land. And certainly if it approaches to land with an engine failure, then raising that wing with an engine out is certainly going to result in a wing stall. And we don't like to stall wings at low altitude on approach to landing. All right, now let's go to a Type 3. Now this could be an amazing airplane. Let's look at how this thing does according to the rules. It's got a big disc area, doesn't it? Look at all those rotors. That adds up. And look at that big wing. And look at how that wing is high aspect ratio. It's long and thin. This thing checks all the boxes. It's got the large disc area. It's got the variable pitch props. The props obviously adjust pitch to adjust for both hover and cruise, which are done at different speeds. And with this variable pitch prop, high aspect ratio wing, large disc area, this aircraft will always be efficient in all modes of flight. This could be an amazing airplane. Problem is, Type 3. Look at the complexity. How many moving parts are there that could fail? What happens if one of these 6 propellers doesn't articulate up into hover or the reciprocal? What if one blade doesn't change pitch or one set of blades doesn't change pitch? So many moving parts, so much to go wrong. On paper, this aircraft is an amazing machine. In practice, I wouldn't be thrilled with wanting to maintain it. Now let's look at a Type 1 vehicle, Cora. This vehicle looks quite good. There's a minimum of complexity, a minimum of moving parts, and each propeller is clearly one piece of carbon fiber and foam and is designed to fly at exactly one speed, which is good for a propeller. It likes to be designed for one speed. These rotors here are designed for the speed that comes through the disc and hover. This pushing prop is clearly designed for the speed the airplane likes to cruise. Each propeller is optimized for its job,
and does so without moving parts in the prop itself. This is starting to check a lot of boxes for being a great airplane. Now, its disk loading is still pretty high. The disk area is a little smaller than we would really like. It's got a high flow speed through that disk and hover, which is going to cause a pretty high hover power requirement. And certainly there's a lot of motors and props here, any one of which could fail. And so if there's a drawback to this airplane, it's that the disk area is not that high, so the hover power requirement will be large. And now finally, we're going to move to what I believe is basically, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate eVTOL design. Let's see how this checks our boxes. Do you see a teardrop-shaped, low-drag fuselage? Is it a large wing? Is the wing high aspect ratio, long and thin? Are the propellers all one piece of carbon fiber and foam? Does it have a minimum number of propellers, and is there a minimum of articulation? Every box is checked with this. The large wing means a low coefficient of lift. The large aspect ratio means low induced drag. The streamlined body means low parasite drag. The large rotors, compared to the size of this little airplane anyway, means low hover power requirement. The fact that these props in hover can clearly be designed for hover, and this prop for cruise can clearly be designed for cruise, means that every prop is optimized for the job it's doing, even though it doesn't transform itself in flight. Simplicity and efficiency are all maximized with this design. This, I believe, is the best design we've looked at. And now I think you see why our airplane is shaped the way it is. Okay, if you have any questions, email me at austin@x-plane.com.